Is Freedom Watch. Tonight, a special President's Day edition of Freedom Watch. History has been too kind to America's leaders.
Ask not what your country can do for you.
Government is the problem.
Here to expose the truth behind America's presidents are historians Tom Woods and Tom DiLorenzo, Reason's Nick Gillespie, and Fox News contributor Monica Crowley. We start with America's greatest president, Thomas Jefferson, the only president who refused to enforce laws that assaulted human freedom. Then America's worst president, Abraham Lincoln. Yes, Honest Abe. No president has done more to undermine the Constitution. And Woodrow Wilson, the president who ushered in the progressive era of huge government, followed by the infamous Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
The only thing we have to fear is
the president who created the world's biggest Ponzi scheme, Social Security. We also take a look at the iconic Jack Kennedy. Had he not been assassinated, what would history look like? And finally, the big disappointment for conservatives. Ronald Reagan preached limited government, only to become president and grow the government. He completely ignored these principles. That government is best which governs least. The people are entitled to a government that stays within the confines of the Constitution. The Constitution was written to keep the government off the people's backs. Woods, Gillespie, Crowley, Freedom Watch. The revolution continues now. Tonight on the docket, we commemorate President's Day with a special edition of Freedom Watch. We'll take a fresh look at 6 presidents you thought you knew well. The president who refused to enforce laws that assaulted human freedom. The president who suspended the writ of habeas corpus. The president who brought us the federal income tax. The president whose election brought a run in the banks. The president who could have changed the course of history in the Vietnam War. And the president who ushered in the modern era of big government conservatism. We start tonight with Thomas Jefferson, who may have been the first president to refuse to enforce federal laws he had sworn to uphold because those laws directly assaulted human freedom. Of all the founding fathers, Jefferson, more than any, rejected the Alien and Sedition Acts, which criminalized speech that put the president or the Congress in a bad light. How could the same generation, indeed even the same human beings who wrote, "Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech," make some political speech a crime? Joining me now is historian and Mises Senior Fellow Tom Woods, Fox News contributor, author, and former Nixon administration Monica Crowley, Nixon administration aide. Nixon aide Monica Crowley, and Reason TV's Nick Gillespie. Thank you, Monica. To you first, Thomas Jefferson. Why did Bill Clinton trash him? Why do libertarians love him? I know I have 2 libertarians with me, but I want you to tell me this.
Well, Thomas Jefferson was considered the sensitive poet of the Founding Fathers, and in some respects his presidency was somewhat contradictory because he did go ahead and want to expand government power in terms of building infrastructure for this new country, in terms of bringing the federal government into education. But he also realized that what they enshrined in the founding documents about very limited centralized government, he did actually try to put in practice, because when you look at his record of actual government control and power, he did try to limit it.
He did understand, Tom Woods, did he not, with his friend and Secretary of State James Madison, that the federal government was one of limited powers, limited just to the 16 items in the Constitution, and that the rest of governmental power was vested in the states. And he actually practiced that, unlike both of his predecessors and virtually all of his successors.
Well, it's indicative of his outlook that when he took office, the Alien Sedition Acts had been set to expire at midnight just before he took office. So not only did he release everyone who had been imprisoned for saying the wrong thing, but he refunded everyone's fine with interest. But that's not to say that he was without blemish, and as I'm sure we'll discuss. There was his embargo. It was thought in New England that the searches and seizures of ships and cargoes were unconstitutional. They didn't reach the threshold of it was just a mere suspicion to export was enough to confiscate your ship.
But he understood probably better than any president what he wrote in the Constitution, that our rights, in the Declaration, thank you, that our rights come from our humanity, and he refused to use the instrument of government to interfere with it.
Generally speaking, and I think the Jefferson that I like the best is the author of the Declaration, where he was writing essentially a matrix, or the source code, if you would, of the American experiment, which ended up kind of extrapolating out into areas that he might not have agreed with, but he created the rights-based discourse that we continue to use to inform the Constitution and everything past it.
Haven't almost all presidents since Jefferson rejected the notion that our rights are natural, that they come from us from our humanity, and accepted the idea that the government, in good times or in bad, can interfere with those rights?
I think that's right, and some presidents have been better on the question than others, but I would put it as Jefferson being sort of the final, maybe the final of the Founding Fathers, but certainly the final of all of the presidents who actually believed that and governed that way.
Tom, was he a better thinker, a better writer, a better philosopher than he was president?
Do you mean Tom Woods?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
I don't know if Tom DiLorenzo is still there.
No, he's not here.
Well, I mean,
you're the only Tom here.
Yeah. Okay, he's the best when he's a thinker and a writer, because I think almost anybody, when you become president, well, inevitably you're going to have failings. And I'll say that one bum rap that he gets is with regard to the Louisiana Purchase. People say, look at this, he contradicted his own strict constructionist views. It should be pointed out, he was practically alone among Republicans in believing that that did violate the Constitution. Almost all of them thought it was covered under the treaty power and that Jefferson was too scrupulous. But yes, indeed, in fact, he was better as an ex-president, too. By the end of his life, he was speculating that even the states were too big and monstrous to deal with.
Many of them are.
Everything should be held at the war level.
I love him and I admire him, but there are flaws.
I think Jefferson...
He actually authorized state prosecutions for speech. He believed the federal government couldn't do it, but since that power was not ceded away, and since the First Amendment was not perceived as regulating the states, he thought that the states could prosecute.
Right, which is problematic. And I think, ultimately, and on President's Day of all day, it's worth thinking about Jefferson as a tragic figure, where on the one hand he was articulating rights in plain language that we continue to refer to to this day, and then in his personal life he lived in a very different way, and in many ways his political life, and it's worth meditating on the difference between those.
Tom Woods, we only have about 30 seconds. Why is it that libertarians like you and I love this man more than any other president?
Well, because he defies all categorization. I mean, he was a broad-minded, learned man who also believed in local self-government. Whereas today, we've come to be convinced that if you believe in local self-government, you're obviously some ignorant hick. But he thought that was where civilization flows, not from the top down, but from the people up.
Jefferson also...
Because he defies these categories, we love him.
Jefferson also established the principle of military intervention abroad. Remember George Washington's farewell address, beware of all foreign entanglements. Thomas Jefferson, 1803, the Barbary Valley.
We're still paying for that.
That's the fly in the ointment here, Monica. Thank you. Stay with us, guys. Coming up, Honest Abe. He's on the face of the penny, and there's a temple for him at the foot of the National Mall that's visited by 4 million people a year. Many historians rank him as our nation's best president. So why do I think he was the worst that we've ever had? That's next. The tales surrounding Abraham Lincoln run as tall as he was. He's often given credit for freeing the slaves, though his famous Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves only in those states that were fighting against the Union and permitted slavery elsewhere. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery in the United States, was not something President Lincoln thought needed to end the Civil War. In fact, he said that if keeping slavery legal would keep the Union together, he would have kept slavery legal. Joining us to cut the Abraham Lincoln myth down to size is economist and scholar Tom DiLorenzo and historian Tom Woods. Guys, welcome back to Freedom Watch. Tom DiLorenzo, to you first. Make the case against the mythology that surrounds Abraham Lincoln.
Oh, well, Judge, in Lincoln's first inaugural address, he pledged his support to enshrine slavery in the Constitution forever, and it's the same speech He used the words force, invasion, and bloodshed to describe what would happen to any state that failed to collect the federal tariff tax, which had just been doubled 2 days before his inauguration. Then he illegally suspended the writ of habeas corpus. He had the Army imprison tens of thousands of northern civilians without due process. This included duly elected members of the Maryland legislature, the mayor of Baltimore, and many newspaper men. He shut down over 300 opposition newspapers. Dean Sprague, the author of a book called Freedom Under Lincoln, said the only place there was genuine free speech in the North during the Civil War was in these prisons where people were already in prison for speaking freely against the Lincoln administration. He deported a congressman from Ohio named Clement Vallandigham, and most importantly, Article 3, Section 3 of the Constitution defines treason as levying war against the states or giving aid and comfort to their enemy. And that, of course, is exactly what Lincoln did, levying war against the states.
Tom Woods, everything that Professor DiLorenzo has just articulated is well documented and cannot be disputed. But most people don't know this. Why is it that when Tom DiLorenzo goes through this list of historical facts about Abraham Lincoln, people start scratching their heads saying, I never knew this, I never knew this, I never heard of that?
Well, the Lincoln myth serves the purposes of the regime, both Democrat and Republican. It serves the purposes of a regime in which power is completely centralized, in which decentralization of power is viewed as suspect, and probably you want to bring back slavery, they suggest, if you favor the states having any powers. It's Lincoln who inaugurates this new version of the United States, a version that's completely at odds with its Jeffersonian foundation. So sure, if you want to exercise unchecked power over the American public, you foster these myths. But imagine, let's suppose we were governed by Walmart instead of the U.S. government, and every kid went into a classroom every morning, and on the wall were all the Walmart CEOs, and one day a year they had a special ceremony for the Walmart CEOs to acknowledge all their great contributions. We would sort of suspect that maybe there's something wrong with this. But when it's U.S. presidents up on the wall, our critical faculties go right out the window because these are our great saviors. This is beneath the dignity of Americans.
Tom, let's just take one example. I think for the first time in modern history, a government waged war on civilians. Lincoln's federal agents and Lincoln's soldiers actually targeted civilians in the South. These were not legitimate military targets. They were utterly undefenseless. They were totally innocent human beings. And yet we don't hear about this in the school books, and it's been whitewashed. Why has it been whitewashed?
It has been whitewashed, Judge, because that's the one thing we can't talk about. According to historian Jeffrey Hummel, some 50,000 Southern civilians perished during the war, and that had to include many slaves and free blacks, by the way. And of course, if we start asking that question and teaching children about this in school and teaching adults about this, they'll begin questioning the Lincoln myth. After all, what kind of humanitarian could micromanage the waging of war on civilians, his own civilians, not foreign civilians, for 4 years? And that would bust up the whole myth, I believe, and that's why they're not taught these in the schools.
Tom Woods, was Lincoln a white supremacist like many whites of his age? Or did he believe that blacks were equal to whites? Was he interested in liberating the slaves from the horrors of slavery in the South?
Well, I do believe that in his heart of hearts he was opposed to slavery. I take him at his word. But as Tom DiLorenzo says, he had other priorities. The Union was a greater priority to him. But in terms of his views on race, well, his views on race were closer to those of the Ku Klux Klan than the NAACP. And he made this very clear repeatedly, and certainly in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, that he has not now, nor ever has he been in favor of interracial relationships or blacks serving on juries or making voters out of them. And it's recently been uncovered because of some recent research, thanks to Dr. Phil Magnus. We now know that contrary to the myth makers, Lincoln, to his dying day, was looking for ways to deport the freed slaves somewhere in the world. We're told that he had abandoned that and he had changed his mind because he was the great humanitarian. He wouldn't have had a view like that. We now know that's another bit of myth-making nonsense. To his dying day, he was of the opinion that they could not be assimilated into American society and needed to be deported. But if you question him, you're the one who's racially suspect.
Got it. Tom DiLorenzo, Tom Woods, us. Coming up, the president who brought you the income tax, the Federal Reserve, and World War I. As you can guess, he's no favorite of mine. That's next.